Okay, today we're going to talk about the causes of the Great Depression here, chapter 21, section 1 in your textbook. And let's talk a little background first of all here, and start with the election of 1928. The Republican nominee was Herbert Hoover, who was from Iowa. And Hoover talked about wanting to end poverty in America. Kind of an ironic statement now that you look back on things, and obviously we have an idea of what happens next. And Hoover really struggled to put a halt to the Great Depression once it got rolling. So Democratic nominee was Alfred Smith. And Hoover won this election rather easily. Remember, the Republicans had been in power throughout the 1920s, and it appeared to be a pretty prosperous decade. So America felt that there really was no need for change at that point. Despite the fact that there were some troubling economic signs that were either ignored or people just didn't really understand them in a lot of cases. You know, the average person just didn't really see these as troubling signs. Farmers were not doing well in the 1920s. 25% of our workforce was made up of farmers. And remember, they had increased production during World War I to basically try and feed the entire world, at least all of Europe, who really couldn't feed themselves during that time while the war was going on and destroying farmland, and farmers were all fighting. So we had a very high supply and lower demand. Farmers did not lower their production. So they're left with that high supply and low demand, which we've talked about supply and demand quite a bit this year. In your textbook, if you take a look at this before you come to class tomorrow, check out the infographics on page 704 and 705. Some really, really good information there to kind of help you understand how these economic troubles are all coming together. Workers' production rose 32% per hour. You know, obviously, increase in technology, machinery, we're producing approximately 32% more goods per hour. Wages are only going up about 8% per hour. So wages were not keeping pace with the increase in production. Basically, you've got the rich getting richer in the 1920s. The business owners, the factory owners, are making more money, and they're not passing it along to their workers. So you see this widening gap between the lower class and the upper class. Corporate profits are up 65%, just kind of referred to that. Rich are getting richer. The wealthiest 1% earn the same amount as the poorest 42%. Think about that. The poorest 42% of the United States was making as much money as the wealthiest 1%. Pretty wide discrepancy there. The wealthy could not or did not need to buy enough to balance things out. So, you know, how many washing machines do you need? How many refrigerators do you need? How many radios do you need? How many cars do you need? How many houses do you need? You know, the wealthiest 1% is not spending enough money to cover for the 42% or more that couldn't afford to buy these luxuries. So again, some supply and demand issues are going to develop here as we see. Also, you have the availability of credit. Really, for the first time in U.S. history, where you've got this wide availability of credit, and you know, it looked like everybody was doing really well. They're buying all these things, Model Ts, radios, all this new technology being developed, but they're not paying for it. They're basically getting it on a loan, and they owe money for it. And it gets to the point where you can even buy groceries on credit in the 1920s. And that developed a huge, huge debt. And people are waiting to be paid, but they haven't been paid yet. 80% of radios and 60% of cars were bought on credit. And then we talk about speculation in the stock market. Speculation is basically gambling on stocks. You could actually put a down payment on a stock, maybe 10%, and get a loan to cover the rest of it. So the danger in that is if that stock were to tank, just not do well, lose value, and you didn't have the money to buy it in the first place, and now you got to come up with the money to pay it off, there's going to be a lot of issues here. So you're starting to see a lot of money being owed and not a lot being paid off as we get towards the end of the decade here. And then it kind of all culminates here on Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. The bottom fell out of the stock market. Billions of dollars and billions of dollars in value of stock literally disappeared overnight. And what you have to remember is a stock is only worth what somebody will pay you for it. And as the panic sets in, the values of those stocks plummets really rapidly. So what do people do? Well, they want to run to the bank and withdraw what little money that they have saved up. The banks do not carry all of your money in on cash. A bank is a business. They're loaning that money out, hoping to make some interest as people repay it. They're investing some of your money, trying to pay you a little bit of interest and make a little bit of money for themselves. So remember, they're a business. They don't just hold your money in a vault. So if all of us go to the bank to get our money, if all the customers for a particular bank show up, at the same time, they can't cover those deposits. And then what happens? Well, at this point, the bank basically fails. It closes. They're out of business. They're bankrupt. However you want to describe it. But in 1929, that happened to 641 banks, and that was just the beginning. 1930, double that, more than double that. 1931, up to 1,700 more banks failed. In 1929, the Fed limited the money supply to cut back on the number of loans, but this also kept people from paying their debts. So the Federal Reserve, we mentioned, was created in the 19-teens to basically control the money supplies, the interest rate on loans coming from banks, things like that. And again, you kind of see the culmination of all of these things, kind of the perfect storm here, if you will, to create what will become the Great Depression. So we start to cut production, right? We're not selling as much, we're not making as much, so we got to make less. Well, if we make less, we have to cut employees, all right? So now we have unemployment growth, fewer people without jobs. People don't have jobs, they don't spend money, all right? Which means more production cuts, and this cycle just continues and spirals downward. By 1933, our unemployment rate is at 25%. That's a huge number. There was a tariff passed called the Hawley-Smoot tariff, which raised tariffs or taxes on imported goods to protect us from foreign competition. We thought that was a way to make people or help people decide to buy American products. Problem is, we're also shipping products to these countries, and those countries are going to retaliate and raise those rates. So that tariff really didn't help solve the problem at all either. Germany stopped paying war reparations in the early 1930s. At the end of the World War I, we talked about the Treaty of Versailles, and we talked about all of the negative provisions in there. One of them was forcing Germany to pay for this war. And their country's in shambles. They just can't do it. And we see the rise of Adolf Hitler in the early 1930s here, which we'll discuss. But a big chunk of money that was coming in to the U.S. at this time was from Germany. And it finally got to the point where the Depression hit Germany before it hit us. And they couldn't do it anymore. So again, now our government is missing out on that money. We forgave France and Britain of war debts. So again, we're not recouping these billions of dollars that we spent in World War I. The Depression reaches Europe, and obviously a lot of trade partners there. And what I want you to do next is in your textbook again, online before you come to class tomorrow, read just kind of the section there, what caused the Great Depression. It's a really good summary of all the things that we're discussing here, and I'll get you ready to go for tomorrow, and we'll cover that moving forward from there. So